Hello, traveler. Sit back, get yourself comfy, and welcome to Campfire Night Stories, a place where I tell cozy bedtime stories meant to help you relax and drift into sleep. Find a quiet moment now. Let the day fade into the background. Tonight, we sit by the fire. Soft light, calm shadows, and a story told slowly, just for you. No rush. No noise. Only rest and a gentle tale to carry you into the night. Tonight's story begins quietly. Not with noise or urgency, but with a moment that feels almost unnoticed. It starts at the edge of a long day, when the world slows down and small details begin to matter again. A place you may have passed before, now waiting to be seen differently. A familiar path, lit by softer light than usual. This is a story about rest after the journey, about warmth found when the night grows long, and about the quiet moments that stay with us longer than we expect. So let the fire burn low. Let the night settle in around you and step gently into the story. September always returned like a half-remembered spell. Soft at first, a whisper of cold in the air, a shift in the light through tall, old windows, and with it, that same familiar ache, the small, impossible wish that somewhere, once, an owl had simply lost its way, that a letter had been written, sealed, stamped with an old crest, and never quite reached the right door. Still, the story goes on without it. The trains still run. The steam still curls into the sky. The barrier still waits, solid and ordinary. Until it isn't. Beyond that brick wall, the platform is already alive. Voices rise and fall. Luggage clatters over stone. A scarlet engine breathes clouds into the cool evening air. Robes swish. Owls ruffle their feathers in wicker cages. Cats peer out with luminous, knowing eyes. A prefect's badge catches the lantern light, flashing gold for a heartbeat. Somewhere in that crowd, a first year clings to a parent's sleeve. Fingers tight. Eyes wide. Heart pounding with the terrible, wonderful fear of beginning. Somewhere else, a seventh year moves slower than usual, dragging their trunk just a moment longer, trying not to think about last times. Last train. Last feast. Last winter in stone corridors that have watched them grow. The whistle will blow soon. It always does. A sharp, bright note cutting through the murmur of goodbyes. But our story tonight does not begin on the train, nor on the bustling platform. It begins farther along the line, past the fields rolling into dusk, past quiet villages and winding rivers. At the end of the journey, where the rails finally surrender to forest and mountain, where a castle waits, lit from within like a lantern in the dark. High towers, deep shadows, windows glowing amber against the gathering night. The boats are already crossing the black mirror of the lake. tiny pinpricks of light bobbing on the water. Voices drift across the surface, thin with nerves, thick with wonder. The carriages roll along the path above, hooves silent on the packed earth. Drawn by creatures most of their passengers never think to notice. And on the hill, watching it all as the first stars prick the sky, stands a man who once thought he had said goodbye to this place forever. Draco Malfoy breathes in the September air. It tastes of damp grass, old stone, and something almost like forgiveness. He stands alone on the path that curves toward the great oak doors. Robes neat. Posture precise. Every line of him controlled, measured, careful. But his hand, resting at his side, curls once. A small, betraying motion, as if part of him is bracing for impact. The carriages jolt to a halt behind him. Student voices swell, then break apart into laughter, questions, whispered rumors. His name floats up once or twice in those hushed, uncertain tones. He does not turn. He does not flinch. He simply looks up at the castle. The windows of the great hall blaze bright against the darkening sky. The ceiling inside will be mirroring that same sky now. Clouds sliding slowly past enchanted stars. Somewhere beyond those walls, the candles are already lit. The banners are already hanging. The tables are laid, goblets waiting, plates gleaming. It should feel like coming home. It does not. It feels like walking into an old memory that no longer quite fits. Like trying on a robe that used to be tailored to you, and finding the shoulders too tight, the hem just a little too short. He draws in another breath, lets it out slowly. The oak doors open before him with a low, familiar groan. The sound pulls threads of the past through his thoughts. Laughter that isn't there anymore. Footsteps of boys who grew up too fast. Shouts. Spells. A night when the walls trembled. He steps inside. The entrance hall rises around him. Cool. Vast. Smelling faintly of stone dust, polish, and rain carried in on many, many shoes. Candles float in the air, steady and pale. Portraits murmur along the walls, their eyes following him with quiet interest. A suit of armor shifts, joints clanking softly, as if bowing in rusty acknowledgement. He moves forward, each footfall echoing just a little too loudly. His own steps sounding strange to him in this place where he once ran, stormed, stalked. A door opens somewhere above. Laughter spills out, then fades. A cat darts down the stairs, brushes past his leg like a streak of smoke, and vanishes into shadow. From beyond the heavy doors ahead, he hears it. The low, constant roar of the great hall in full feast. The hum of hundreds of lives crossing paths. The beginnings of friendships. The continuations of grudges. The everyday, ordinary magic of being young and here and unbroken by the world just yet. For a moment, he hesitates. His hand hovers over the iron ring of the great hall door. If he turns away now, he could vanish back into the life he knows. Back to curses stored in vaults, to gold and goblins and problems that don't look him in the eye with 11-year-old faces. But the moment passes. He closes his fingers around the cold metal. Pushes. The doors swing inward. Light floods over him. Warm. Golden. Blinding for a heartbeat. Then the great hall comes into focus. Candles drift beneath a ceiling painted with twilight. Clouds streak across the false sky, catching the last faint blush of the sun. Long tables stretch out in 4 familiar rivers of color and house pride. A sea of faces turns, almost as one. Some are curious. Some wary. Some entirely indifferent, more interested in the roast potatoes than in the new professor standing at the threshold. His name rustles through the hall like a changing wind. Not shouted. Not cheered. Not booed. Just passed along. Heavy with stories these children never lived, but have heard all the same. Draco squares his shoulders. The old habit of arrogance fits him like armor, even if it pinches at the edges now. He walks the length of the hall toward the staff table. Each step a quiet negotiation between the boy he was and the man he is trying to be. At the far end, beneath the largest of the floating candle clusters, the staff table waits. A row of faces, some new, some painfully familiar. In the center, Minerva McGonagall sits straight-backed, hands folded, eyes clear as cut glass. She watches his approach with a gaze that misses nothing. He reaches his seat. She inclines her head, the smallest of nods. A welcome, yes, but also a reminder of promises made in the flicker of green flame, of expectations. He sits. The Sorting Hat's song fades into silence. A small, trembling first year is called forward, their name echoing through the hall. The stool looks larger than it ever did when he was young. Or perhaps the children are simply smaller now, and he is taller. Or perhaps it is only that time has stretched so much between then and now that nothing is quite in proportion anymore. The hat shouts a house. Cheers erupt. The student runs, nearly tripping over their own feet, toward their new table. Draco watches. Not as a rival. Not as a boy trying to make sure his house is winning some invisible contest. He watches as someone who has been dragged, unwillingly and unexpectedly, into the role of guardian, of guide, of teacher. The word still feels foreign in his mind. Heavy. Dangerous. Hopeful. Plates fill. Goblets brim. Conversations rise and fall like waves. At the staff table, the talk flows around him. Fragments reach his ears. A misbehaving cauldron in the dungeons. A new tapestry in a draughty corridor. A student whose broom refuses to cooperate. He picks at his food more than he eats it. The nervousness sits just under his ribs like a poorly brewed potion, threatening to slosh over. Down at the house tables, a few students look up at him now and then. quick glances, whispers shared behind lifted hands. A Muggle-born boy nudges his friend and points, curiosity outweighing fear. A girl with a badge on her chest studies him with quiet, assessing eyes, already forming opinions she'll pretend are entirely rational. He keeps his gaze steady, unbothered, careless. Inside, he is counting. Timetables. Lesson plan. Possible disasters. Shield charms. First years. Wands too big for small hands. He imagines the classroom. The desks. The dust on forgotten tomes. The expectant faces turned toward him, waiting to be shown how to protect themselves from the very kind of magic he once chose, once wielded. He presses his tongue to the back of his teeth, is less than Hasson. Ling Jing Hao Da Yu reminds himself he accepted this. That he walked through the firelight in his office and said yes. Far above, unseen from the great hall, the castle breathes around him. Stones settling. Ghosts drifting through their familiar routes. Staircases slowly beginning to shift into their nightly patterns. Tomorrow, the lessons will begin. Spells will fly, some of them hitting the wrong targets. Cauldrons will boil over. Quills will scratch furiously over fresh parchment. But tonight is a threshold. A man who thought his story here was over sits at a table he never imagined calling his own. Children who do not know the weight of his past laugh and bicker and pass the pumpkin juice. And the castle, ancient and patient, opens its doors a little wider, waiting to see what they will all make of each other. This year, this time, in this place where beginnings and second chances quietly, stubbornly, insist on existing. The first crack in the quiet came from halfway down the Gryffindor table. Do you think he's as bad as they say? Not quite a whisper. Not quite brave enough to be normal conversation. The words slipped out, carried on a breath of nerves and curiosity, and climbed upward to where he sat. Draco did not look. He did not need to. He could feel the question, sharp as a pin pressed between his shoulder blades. Near the far end of Slytherin, a knot of older students leaned together. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it was bright and edged. They traded stories the way people once traded chocolate frog cards. Tales of cursed cupboards and dark corridors. Of a boy who had worn a prefect badge and a mark on his arm. Of a name spoken in hushed, delighted horror, as if he were some dangerous relic pulled from a locked vault. Something to be studied. Prodit. Never quite believed to be real. Draco wrapped his fingers around his goblet. Pumpkin juice shifted, amber and harmless, catching the candlelight. He turned the cup slowly, stared into it as if it held his whole attention. The picture of boredom, of thin, practiced indifference. Only the faintest tightening of his hand betrayed him. Knuckles pale, tension hiding in the angle of his wrist. At his side, the new charms professor talked. Words tumbled out in a cheerful stream. Wandwoods. Core alignments. Some misguided theory about the mental health benefits of standardizing broomstick safety charms. Draco answered without looking up. Short replies. One syllable when possible. Polite enough to avoid complaint. Cold enough to discourage hope. It worked. After a few minutes, the little man's enthusiasm sagged. He turned away, relief and wounded pride mixed together, and began an animated conversation with the groundskeeper about gnome relocation ethics. The noise of the hall swelled and softened around Draco. Cutlery chimed. A ghost drifted past the far wall like an absent thought. He reached for bread, then changed his mind halfway, letting his hand fall back to the table. At the center of it all, the headmistress rose. The ripple of sound died away in waves. A few last laughs fizzled out. A first year swallowed a mouthful of pudding too fast and coughed into their sleeve. McGonagall's words flowed over him in familiar cadences. Welcome back. Well done on making it through the first week. Mind the staircases. Mind each other. He watched her, but only partly. The rest of his gaze drifted outward. Plates cleared themselves in a shimmer of magic. Candles dipped lower. Students began to stand in uneven clusters. A river of black robes and bright house colors surged toward the doors. The tide of a new year pulling itself toward common rooms, to-do lists, secret plans. Laughter snagged on stone pillars. Footsteps echoed. Somewhere near the doors, someone started humming a tune wildly off-key and was promptly shushed. Draco stayed seated. Hands folded. Expression carved into something smooth and unreadable. He watched them go. Small faces. Older ones. A boy with a crooked tie. A girl carrying 3 books she clearly did not intend to put down even for sleep. They streamed past without seeing him properly. Not yet. Not as more than a story at the staff table. Something flickered in his chest. Not quite regret. Not quite longing. Something that hurt like nostalgia and felt like standing on the wrong side of a locked door. When the last of the chatter faded and the hall fell into that soft, echoing quiet, it kept only late at night and early in the morning, Draco rose. He followed a corridor his feet already knew. The 3rd floor greeted him with dim lamps and long shadows. Stone cool under his boots. The faint dust smell of old magic and older secrets. He had walked these passages as a boy. Running from trouble. Running toward it. Hiding behind sneers and borrowed power. Now he walked as a man who had survived all of that and somehow found himself back where the story had begun. Portraits lined the walls, frames thick with age and varnish. Painted figures paused mid-argument, mid-nap, mid-card game to watch him pass. Some frowned. Some tilted their heads, trying to place the memory of his face against the lines of the man before them. Whispers bled from frame to frame. Names. Dates. The word war half swallowed. He ignored them. Or tried to. The door to his office loomed out of the gloom. Heavy wood. Iron hinges. Sturdy enough to hold back almost anything except his own thoughts. He pushed it open. The room inside was small, rectangular, and utterly bare. No flicker of warmth. No scattered parchment, no crowded bookshelves sagging under the weight of a life's collection. Just a desk. A few shelves. A narrow window with a view of dark stone and a strip of night. It did not welcome. It did not accuse. It simply was. Draco stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind him. The latch clicked with a soft finality. He set his briefcase on the desk, the leather making a dull, familiar sound. The kind of sound that belonged to contracts and ledgers, not lesson plans. One by one, he unpacked. Books first. Dark creatures. Obscure curses stripped of their romance and laid out in clinical diagrams. Margins speckled with notes from years he did not like to remember. Then the silver pocket watch. Its surface glinted coldly when it caught the candlelight. He placed it at the corner of his desk, exactly parallel to the edge. His father's. Ticking had never sounded so quiet. Last, a photograph. His mother, captured in a moment of perfect stillness. Chin lifted. Eyes distant, like she was looking at something far past the camera and far past him. Her lips did not move, though the photo shimmered faintly with enchantment. Of course not. She had never been one to say more than necessary. He set her beside the books, as though she were watching over the classroom that was not yet there. The lesson planner lay at the bottom of the case. Its cover was worn smooth at the edges. His thumb brushed over it once before he opened it. Blank pages stared back at him. Row after row. Week after week. Space waiting to be filled with structures, spells, contingencies. He flipped through. He did not see neat schedules and tidy lists. He saw potential disasters. Overpowered hexes. Weeping first years. Letters sent home. He closed the planner with a snap that felt louder than it was. If a man who had once signed his name to things he could never unsign could not manage a timetable. A dry, reluctant smirk tugged at his mouth. Somewhere in his memory, a smiling fool with shining teeth and too perfect hair waved from a book cover. That man had held this post once. Had written about it. Had survived it, in his own cowardly way. Draco let the smirk curl a fraction deeper. If that imbecile had lasted even a term, he could manage it too. Without the theatrics. Without the vanity. Hopefully. A knock broke through the quiet. Sharp. Brisk. He straightened instinctively. Old habits of formality slipped into place around him like a cloak. The door opened before he could answer. Of course it did. McGonagall stepped inside. Her presence filled the room more completely than the meager light. Hat in Hand. Lines of exhaustion gentle at the corners of her eyes. She looked around once, taking in the barren shelves, the single photograph, the precise order of things. Settling in all right, Mr. Malfoy? The question was mild. The assessment behind it was not. Draco glanced around as if to remind himself what there was to assess. The bare walls. The watch. His mother's still gaze. As well as can be expected, he said. The words came out level. Almost bored. She hummed, a soft sound of doubtful agreement. It doesn't seem that long, she went on, since you were keeping these corridors far busier than they needed to be. A memory flickered. Teenage footsteps pounding over stone. A laugh he no longer trusted himself to remember clearly. He let out something that could have been a laugh if it had had more heart in it. Feels like several lifetimes ago, he said instead. Strange, how often we end up back where we started. Her mouth twitched. Note kite a smile. Note kite disapproval. Strange, she agreed softly. Or perhaps exactly what some of us need. The look she gave him then held no pity. Pity would have been easier to hate. This was worse. Recognition. A quiet, measured belief that he might yet be worth the trouble. It made him want to shrug it off, to sharpen his tone. She spared him the effort. My door is open, she said simply. If you need anything, or if your students become overly creative. He slipped into the familiar armor of arrogance with grateful ease. I've dealt with cursed vaults, and worse, he answered, mouth tilting into something sharper. I think I can manage a few overexcited children. The bravado tasted thin even to his own ears. McGonagall's expression said she heard it too. She did not argue. Very well, she said, and her voice held the faintest hint of amusement. Good night, Professor. The title landed in the room like a small, undeniable spell. She left. The door closed behind her with a soft, decisive click. Silence folded back over the office. Draco stood for a moment, listening to the absence of sound, to the faint, distant murmur of the castle breathing beyond the walls. Then he sat. Hands moved of their own accord, straightening the books, aligning the watch, adjusting the angle of the photograph by a fraction of an inch. As if, with enough precision, the shape of his life here might suddenly make sense. He did not admit, even to himself, what had driven him to say yes when the fire had flared green and her face had appeared in his hearth. He told himself it was duty. Obligation. An old debt called in. He told himself he did not care about stone halls and laughing children. About this castle that had seen the worst of him. He told himself he was here because she had asked, and because saying no had not felt like an option. The castle, listening as it always did, said nothing. Later, as lamps dimmed and dormitories grew quiet overhead, he leaned back in his chair. The planner lay closed before him. The watch ticked on. On nights like this, when the dark felt gentle rather than accusing, and the weight of tomorrow's lessons settled more like a blanket than a burden, a thought brushed against the edges of his mind. Maybe this could be more than penance. More than an old woman's request. Maybe. He did not follow that thought far. He let it hover for a moment, then stored it away with the other things he was not ready to name. The weeks slid forward. He built routines the way some people built walls. Office in the early morning. Classrooms humming with spellfire through the day. Evenings unfolding beneath the quiet arches of the library. Stacks of books grew around his chosen table. Bestiaries. Obscuretritices. Field reports written by witches and wizards who had actually faced the things they wrote about rather than dramatizing them. He convinced himself he was there only for research, for new methods, sharper demonstrations, better traps to spring on inattentive minds. If, occasionally, he felt a thin thread of satisfaction when a room full of students gasped at a particularly elegant piece of defensive magic, well, he ignored that too. The students ignored nothing. They were loud in their living, unapologetic in their testing of boundaries. Gryffindors with too much courage and too little self-preservation treated his classroom like a challenge. They poked at his patience, measured the sharpness of his sarcasm, pushed until they found the line. Slytherins watched him with narrowed eyes, weighing stories against the quiet, exacting man before them. Some tried to impress him. Some tried to provoke him. None quite dared to treat him as one of their own. Hufflepuffs, gentle and underestimated, occasionally produced pranks so inventive and bizarre that he didn't know whether to assign detention or extra credit. One afternoon dissolved into chaos so complete that it felt almost orchestrated. A misfired jinx ricocheted off a shield charm, setting half the classroom's inkwells to burp bubbles of violet smoke. Someone's desk sprouted legs. 2 first-years burst into simultaneous, uncontrollable giggles that made it impossible for them to speak the incantations they needed to end it. By the time he made it back to his office, his temples throbbed in sync with the ticking of his father's watch. He dropped into his chair and stared up at the ceiling. The stone did not offer answers. "Were we ever that bad?" he muttered. Memories rose, slippery and unreliable. Snares. Midnight duels. Detours down forbidden corridors. But time had eroded the edges, softened his own role in the stories. He let the question hang unanswered and moved on. The season turned. One morning, the air outside bit at exposed skin, crisp and clean. A thin mist clung to the grounds. Pumpkins swelled fat and bright in the distant patch. On a whim, or perhaps out of a restless need to do more than recite incantations at a blackboard, he changed his lesson plan. The next day, he stood at the front of his classroom and looked out over a row of shifting, curious faces. "Tomorrow," he said, voice smooth, "we are not staying in here." A rustle of interest swept through the room. "We will be going into the forest," he went on. A practical lesson in what lives in the dark and how not to be eaten by it. A Gryffindor's hand shot up. He ignored it. "It will be a test of your spells," he said, "and your composure. The latter will be more useful than the former." Whispers erupted as soon as the bell rang. Forbidden. Forest. Did he say eaten? He's joking. He doesn't joke. The following afternoon, they gathered at the castle steps. Scarves looped tight. Robes pulled close. Breath puffing in small white clouds. Houses mingled more than usual at the edge of that particular uncertainty. Fear and excitement did not respect the familiar lines of the great hall. Draco arrived last. Cloak collar turned up against the wind. Wand already in hand. "Follow," was all he said. They crossed the grounds. Grass crackling faintly under boots, gone stiff with early frost. The tree line loomed ahead, a wall of trunks and tangled branches. The forest did not move. It waited. The first step beneath its canopy was like stepping into another world. Light thinned to a greenish dusk. The scent changed. Damp earth, old leaves, something sharp and wild. The castle's hum faded behind them. The forest's own quiet rose up to take its place. Draco lifted his wand. Lumos. White light flared at the tip. Clean. Steady. Dozens of smaller lights kindled in response as students whispered the spell. Their glow scattered across bark, roots, anxious faces. "Stay close," he said, not bothering to raise his voice. The forest carried sound well enough. "This place is older than this school, than most countries. It will not change itself to keep you safe. That is your task." He led them along a narrow path, his stride sure. Webs caught the light high above, glistening like threads of spun glass. Branches creaked. Something large moved far to their right, hidden in the deeper shadows. They reached a small clearing. At its center, half buried in moss, stood a ring of stones. Weathered. Leaning. They looked less like a ruin and more like a sleeping thing. "Here," he said. He pointed out the shimmer of fine silk strung between two trees at the clearing's edge. Acromantula webbing, silver and too perfect. He showed them the telltale scratches of bowtruckles on a nearby trunk, the subtle signs of their watchful irritation. He spoke of hazard and respect in the same tone. Demonstrated spells with crisp, economical movements. Instruction came easily. Too easily. If any part of him enjoyed the way they hung on his next word, well, he was spared from thinking about it. A sound broke the air. Skittering. Wrong-sized. He felt it first in the way the fine hairs on the back of his neck lifted. Then he heard it. He raised a hand. Quiet. The chatter cut off at once. Breaths held. Wand lights bobbing subtly as hands tightened. The noise grew. dry leaves disturbed. A low, rhythmic click. Draco's eyes narrowed, fixed on a particularly dense patch of undergrowth. The shadows there seemed to shift independently of the wind. Then it stepped out. 8 legs, jointed and thick as broomsticks, tested the open ground. A massive body, fur matted and dark. Eyes like black beads, dozens of them, taking in the cluster of small, bright humans. An acromantula. Young by the forest standards. Large enough to kill half the class. It paused. Head tilted slightly. Weighing risk and reward. Then, with jarring speed, it surged forward. "Wands up," Draco snapped. His own arm was already rising. His stance shifted, weight centered. Remember what you've practiced. Stay calm. Keep your distance. Around him, the class sucked in a collective breath and obeyed. More or less. Magic thrummed in the air like building storm pressure. The spider reared back. Fangstglissnel. Venom dripped, hissing soft as it hit the forest floor. Impedimenta. His spell shot forward, blue-white and precise. It hit the creature squarely, slowing the arc of its next lunge. Not stopping it. Nothing about the situation suggested safety. The spider shuddered and pushed through the drag of magic, one leg lashing out. A student stumbled back, cloak snagging, nearly falling. Fear spiked, sharp and bright. Spells broke loose. Stunners, too weak, but numerous. Knockback jinxes cast with more panic than technique. Shield charms flaring and faltering in quick succession. The forest flashed with bursts of color, is less than Hasson. Ling Jing Hao Da Yu. Red. Blue. A fractured tapestry of desperate light against the dark. Draco moved through it, wand steady, mind cold and clear, in a way that felt unnervingly familiar. A dozen young hearts beat hard behind him, in front of him, all around. This time, their lives were his to guard. This time, he was the one standing between them and what waited in the dark. McGonagall's answer came without hesitation. "No," she said, dry as old parchment. "They were worse." A tiny pause. A faint, almost wicked glint in her eye. "Yours especially." Draco huffed, a low sound that might have been a laugh if it had more air. He stared into his mug instead. Foam clung to the rim in uneven crescents. "Comforting," he muttered. "Truly." Outside, snow threaded down past the window in slow, thoughtful spirals. Inside, the pub hummed with soft conversation and clinking glasses. McGonagall leaned back in the booth, the lamplight cutting sharp lines along her cheekbones, softening them a moment later. "You forget," she said, "that being unbearable at 11 rarely disqualifies one from becoming useful later." He raised a brow. "Is that your motivational speech, then?" Her mouth twitched. "I'm saving the inspirational one for the end of term." Silence settled between them again. Not hostile. Simply full. In the corner, a group of younger teachers argued over some obscure rule change. Laughter flared, then dipped. Draco shifted his grip on the mug. The ghost of that howler still rang somewhere deep in his bones. "I knew it would follow me," he said at last, voice low. "The name. The stories. But I thought—" He trailed off. The words refused to line up. McGonagall watched him with that unnerving calm of hers, the kind that saw more than he intended to show. "You thought time would do the work for you," she supplied quietly. "Wear it down. Blunt the edges." He gave a small, precise nod. "Naive of me." "No," she said. "Human." He looked up at that. "Human. Not monster. Not X something." The word sat strangely in his chest. Warm and ill-fitting. "You are not required to prove yourself to every voice that can purchase a howler," she went on. "Your work will speak more loudly than they ever could." Draco thought of the forest, of venom steaming against his shield, of students who had not run. "Assuming," he said, "I don't get them all killed in the process." Her gaze sharpened. "I reviewed your report," she said. "Your precautions were sound. Your response, efficient. A beat. I do not make a habit of employing reckless men, Mr. Malfoy." He let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The tension eased a fraction from his shoulders. For a while, they simply sat. Two old fixtures of a castle that refused to stay only in the past. Steam rose from their drinks and vanished into the pub's warm air. After some time, McGonagall checked the watch pinned neatly at her collar. "Curfew approaches," she said. "I imagine you have essays to mark and children to terrify with honesty tomorrow." He smirked. "Something like that." She stood. Her cloak fell around her in a sweep of dark red, catching the light like a slow ember. At the door, she paused and looked back. "This place chose to open its doors to you again," she said. "Try not to slam them in your own face." Then she was gone, swallowed by the flurry of snow and evening. Draco sat a little longer. The pub emptied by slow degrees. Chairs scraped. Candles shortened. The barmaid wiped circles into the worn wood. Eventually he rose, wrapped himself in his cloak, and stepped back out into the cold. Hogsmeade at night glowed soft and golden. Lanterns floated above the street in lazy arcs. Footprints muddied the fresh snow, then filled back in as more flakes drifted down. He walked without hurrying. The chill cleared the dregs of butterbeer from his head. By the time the castle loomed ahead, black against the pale sky, his thoughts had settled into something almost orderly. Hogwarts waited, lit from within. Windows like watchful eyes. Warm squares of light scattered across stone. The gates opened to him without protest. Wrought iron swung inward with a familiar groan. As he crossed the grounds, the snow came higher, numbing the edges of his boots. His breath plumed out in quiet bursts. He glanced up once, instinctively. The towers cut stark lines against the sky. Somewhere behind those walls, children argued over cards and essays and who had the better broom. For the first time in a long time, the sight did not feel like accusation. It felt heavy, real. His responsibility. Inside, the entrance hall was almost empty. Only the echo of distant laughter from a far corridor, the soft rustle of a wandering ghost. He climbed the stairs. They shifted halfway, as they always had. He rode out the lurch with practiced balance, hand steady on the banister. On the third floor, the corridor stretched ahead, dim and quiet. Torches burned low. Portrait dozed. A witch in an elaborate ruff cracked one painted eye as he passed. "Back late, aren't you?" she muttered. "Working," he answered without stopping. She sniffed, apparently satisfied, and sank back into her nap. His office door loomed, familiar now. Less like a barrier. More like a threshold he crossed every day and still, somehow, did not quite trust. He stepped inside. The room greeted him with its usual spare order. Desk. Shelves. The narrow window framing night and a faint scattering of stars. His mother's photograph caught the candlelight as he lit the sconces. Her gaze was as remote as ever. "Well," he said softly, shrugging out of his cloak. "You did always say humiliation built character." The picture did not answer. Of course it didn't. He set the cloak over the back of his chair, straightened the stack of essays waiting for him, and sat. The first parchment he picked up was splattered with ink and scribbled corrections. Sammy Blackwood's neat hand marched determinedly down the page. Her essay on counter curses was precise, thoughtful, too cautious in places. He could almost see the way she second-guessed her own conclusions halfway through a sentence. A ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth. He reached for his quill, wrote in the margin, in his clean, sharp script, "Trust your analysis. Your first instinct was correct. Do not talk yourself out of being right." He set the parchment aside, reached for the next. Outside, the wind moved along the stone like a low, restless sigh. Inside, the scratch of his quill and the faint ticking of his father's watch filled the quiet. Hours thinned. Ink stained his fingers. The pile of unmarked essays shrank, slowly, grudgingly. Every so often his gaze drifted to the window, is less than Hasson. Ling Jing Hao Da Yu, to the ghost reflection of his own face in the glass. Professor. The title still felt like a borrowed robe. A size too big. The hem dragging on floors he had once raced across as a boy with far too much arrogance and far too little sense. He kept writing. Detentions assigned with reluctant precision. Praises given sparingly, where they were earned. questions scrawled in the margins to hound the more complacent minds. By the time he set his quill down, the candles had guttered low. Wax pooled. Shadows reached longer across the desk. He flexed his cramped hand and rolled his shoulders, joints protesting. On the edge of the desk, the red envelope's ashes still sat in a neat little pile. He had gathered them earlier, almost unconsciously, instead of vanishing them. Now he looked at them properly. At the faint curl of singed paper. So much noise. So little weight. With a small, dismissive flick of his wand, he sent the remnants into the wastebasket. They vanished with a whisper of displaced air. What remained in the room was his work. The essays. The plans. The echo of his own words written on other people's thoughts. He leaned back in his chair. The castle seemed to listen. Stone thick around him. Past and present layered like old spellwork. He thought of the forest again. Of the way the students had stood their ground. Of the spark in their eyes when the danger had passed and realization had set in. They had not seen a monster that day. Not a relic. They had seen a man in front of them, wand raised, telling them not to run. That, perhaps, was a beginning. He blew out the last candle. Darkness folded in, soft rather than suffocating. He sat for a moment longer in the quiet, listening to the tick of the watch and the faint, distant murmur of the castle alive around him. Then he rose, shrugged off the day as best he could, and let sleep come. Tomorrow, the children would arrive in his classroom again. Laughing. Arguing. Testing. And he would be there. Not to outrun his past, but to stand, day after day, between them and the mistakes he knew too well. The castle watched. The year turned. Somewhere in all of it, almost against his will, Draco Malfoy began to belong. Your lot was dreadful. The admission slipped out of McGonagall like a secret she'd been waiting years to enjoy. Her laugh followed it. Real. Light. Startling in its warmth. I lost track of how many times I caught you sneaking about. Breaking things. Breaking rules. You and your cohort were a full-time occupation. Draco's answering chuckle shaved the edges off his usual arrogance. Something gentler settled in its place. We might have been spirited, he allowed, but we had charm. Her eyes brightened, that familiar, feline amusement flickering there. If you insist, Mr. Malfoy. Every generation believes it was exceptional. Yours was no different. Merely louder. He smirked, nostalgia folding over him like an old, threadbare cloak. So you mean to say I was a menace, and I've simply repressed most of it? Tragic. I'll look into a memory charm. She ignored the bait with professional finesse, hiding a smile behind the rim of her glass. For a moment they simply regarded one another. The weight of old battles and detentions and late-night patrols softened. Not erased. Just lighter. When Draco rose to leave, something unexpected sat in his chest. Not dread, not shame, a quiet knowledge. The castle had seen the worst of him and opened the doors anyway. Again. Hogwarts did that. For those who insisted on walking back through. The week before Christmas, the castle surrendered itself to winter. It didn't happen all at once. First came the garlands. Dark green ropes of holly that unfurled along the staircases overnight, berries glinting like drops of frozen blood. House elves darted in and out of sight, fingers quick, magic quicker. Then the lights appeared. Tiny, hovering specks. Gold, silver, frost, blue. They tucked themselves into alcoves and under arches, turning draughts into glimmers. The great hall remade itself last. One morning, Draco walked in to find the ceiling spilling slow, deliberate snow. The flakes swayed down, melted into nothing inches above the students' heads. Long tables steamed with breakfast. At the far end, a forest of Christmas trees reached almost to the charmed sky. They were absurdly tall, each one dripping with bewitched ornaments that hummed faint carols or spun lazily like miniature dancers, skirts of glass and light. Draco stood near the doors, watching. Not quite part of it. Not quite a part, either. The chatter bounced off the stone, louder than usual, edged with holiday impatience. His students tackled even revision with a sort of reckless eagerness. Even the sullen ones. Even the ones who sighed theatrically at homework. He kept his expression bland, his tone dry, his standards high. Inside, something in him unclenched. Fraction by fraction. Perhaps it was the way they groaned when he added extra hex drills. Or the way they nevertheless turned up, wands ready, cheeks pink from the cold. He pushed them. Insisted. Forced them to realize they were more capable than they believed. And he pretended, stubbornly, that this was all it was. Work. Duty. Nothing as dangerous as caring. The summons came on a bitter afternoon. Staff meeting. Urgent. McGonagall's owl had dropped the note onto his desk with the efficiency of long practice. He'd stared at the terse handwriting for a heartbeat too long before folding it once, precisely, and heading up. In the staff room, the fire burned high. Comfortable chairs were filled with varying degrees of alarm and boredom. Tea steamed on low tables. McGonagall stood near the mantel, spectacles gleaming. All business. No twinkle. The ministry will be conducting an inspection, she announced. The Department of Magical Education has deemed it routine. The word landed with universal skepticism. A High Inquisitor of Educational Excellence will be observing classes over the next week. I expect professionalism. And her gaze swept them like a measuring spell. Sense. Lips tightened. Someone groaned softly into their cup. Draco kept his face neutral, hands folded. Inside, something cold and familiar twisted once beneath his ribs. Ministry? Judgment. Review. He'd spent years trying to crawl out from under the last set of official opinions about him. Of course they were sending someone. Of course they were. He told himself it didn't matter. That he'd survived far worse than a pedantic inspector with a clipboard. That his work here could stand on its own. He told himself this. Repeatedly. The tension in his shoulders refused to listen. When the meeting dissolved into small pockets of anxious planning, Draco remained where he was for a moment, running through lesson plans in his head like a tactical drill. How to look organized without looking rehearsed. Demanding without cruelty. Innovative without reckless. He almost laughed. Once, he'd plotted ambushes and escapes in these corridors. Now he strategized seating arrangements and demonstration spells. He left the staff room with his jaw set. He had walked through battlefields, taken curses meant for others, and stepped aside to let far worse pass by. He had stood in courtrooms while people decided, publicly, what his life was worth. One more spectator? He could endure that. Probably. The students, blissfully ignorant, decorated their common rooms with tinsel that mysteriously changed house colors, staged snowball fights in the courtyards, and argued passionately over whether exams should be banned by decree. Draco watched them from doorways and along corridors. A strange tangle of exasperation and pride coiling tight in his chest. Teaching, he was discovering, was not command. It was something closer to navigation. You didn't control them. You steered. Held the line when they pushed too far. Let them fall carefully when they needed the lesson. Sometimes he snapped. Sometimes he said more than he meant. And then a student would meet his eyes in the middle of a spell, waiting, trusting him to catch them if the magic broke. It did something uncomfortable to him, that trust. Chipped away at old armor. A few days later, his last lesson before exams hummed with a particular kind of tension. Not fear. Anticipation. Desks had been pushed aside. Chairs stacked neatly against the wall. The classroom had become an arena. Today, Draco said, voice carrying easily to the back, we stop pretending danger will queue up politely and wait its turn. Wands in hands. Eyes on him. He outlined the exercise. Multiple curses coming at them from more than one direction. Limited cover. Limited time. They would need to communicate. Adapt. Trust. He walked them through formations. Signals. What to prioritize when everything went wrong at once. Think, he said, faster than fear. They began. Spells flashed. Shields blossomed, faltered, steadied. Voices cut through the noise sharp, urgent commands from children trying on the shape of leadership. Draco moved among them, adjusting a stance here, flicking a wand there, deflecting a misaimed jinx with bored precision. This he knew how to do. The door creaked open. The sound sliced neatly through the chaos. Draco glanced up, annoyance already forming into a tight remark. and stopped. Hermione Granger stood on the threshold. Not in school robes. Not in the ink-stained jumper he remembered from endless library evenings. Formal ministry attire sat on her like armor. Crisp fabric. Clean lines. A badge glinting at her shoulder. Her hair, usually some degree of wild, was tamed into a severe knot. Quill and notepad hovered at the ready. Her gaze swept the room, taking everything in at once. Measuring. Cataloging. Of course. Of course it would be her. Draco exhaled once, a short, incredulous sound. Then the smirk found its way to his mouth all on its own. Professor Malfoy. Her voice was cool. Professional. The only sign of anything else was the faintest light at the corner of her eyes. I'm here to observe your class. He pulled his features into something approximating polite welcome. Miss Granger, he replied, giving the title a deliberate weight. Defense against the dark arts. As you can see, nobody's died yet. A small twitch betrayed her before she could stop it. Her eyebrow lifted. She let his remark pass unchallenged. Don't let me interrupt, she said, and slipped to the back of the room. Quill still poised. Attention absolute. He watched her for a breath. The way she noted wand movements. The chalk diagrams on the board. The pattern of their drills. Old memories pressed in. Her hand shooting into the air. Her exasperated sighs whenever he drawled something particularly cutting. He turned away before the past could crowd the present. Keep moving, he barked, stepping back into the middle of the room. If you leave a gap in the line, something will find it. I promise you that. He threw his focus into them. Into the work. Correcting angles. Deflecting a curse that would have left a nasty burn. Praising here and there, where it was earned. The odd thing was, he didn't have to pretend the enthusiasm. Not anymore. The lesson had become something alive, humming under his hands. The class responded to it, weaving around one another with growing confidence. A combined shield went up with almost no prompting. A complicated counterhex rippled down the line of wands, synchronized enough to make his chest pull tight with reluctant satisfaction. From the back of the room, Hermione watched. At one point, when a Hufflepuff executed a difficult block with near-perfect timing, Draco heard the faintest, surprised intake of breath from her direction. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. He could feel it. Her expectation adjusting. Recalibrating. By the time the exercise ended, cheeks were flushed, hair disheveled, and more than one robe cuff was smoking gently. Nobody looked bored. Nobody looked broken. They looked alive. And hungry for the next challenge. Again over the holidays, Draco said, as they gathered their things. On your own time. In pairs. No unsupervised curse battles in corridors. If I hear about it, I'll know whose idea it was. A ripple of weary laughter broke out. He let it run, then dismissed them with a sharp gesture. As the students began to stream out, he risked a glance toward the back. Hermione was writing. Quick, efficient strokes. When she looked up, her face had settled into something unreadable. But there, behind the professionalism, was a glint. Approval. It hit him harder than he liked. He retreated to his desk, arranging parchment into neat piles that did not require arranging. The old instinct to look occupied, untouchable, resurfaced without invitation. Behind him, voices murmured. He heard Hermione speak. Heard the soft scuff of a chair. How's your year been, Miss Blackwood? Sammy. Draco's hand paused on a stack of essays. He could picture the girl without looking. Bright, sharp, still learning where to put her defiance. There was a beat of surprised silence then. It's been really good, Mum. The words slid through the air, strange and intimate in his classroom. Sammy's voice warmed as she went on. Professor Malfoy is not what I thought he'd be. He doesn't let anyone bother me. Hepushsus. And we had a lesson in the forest. It was terrifying and brilliant. Draco stared determinedly at his blotter. Forbidden Forest. He could practically feel Hermione's eyebrows climbing from across the room. He heard the scratch of her quill. Heard it stop. Then, faintly amused, the Forbidden Forest. Adventurous. He risked a fraction of a glance sideways. Her gaze met his across the room. A warning there. A scolding. And threaded through both, maddeningly, a trace of respect. Heat crept up the back of his neck, utterly betraying him. He turned away, pretending to shuffle lesson plans that were already in flawless order. Students trickled out. The last stragglers finally hustled along. The room quieted. Hermione remained by her daughter for a moment longer. Then, deliberately, she raised her voice. Sammy, she said, light, as if discussing homework. If anyone gives you grief, if they say anything cruel, you have my full permission to punch them squarely on the nose. The silence that followed was brief but electric. Draco let out an incredulous scoff that turned unwillingly into an almost laugh. Excellent guidance, he drawled, looking up at last. Straight from the ministry's finest. Her eyes slid to him, knowing, unrepentant. Self-defense, she said. Very on topic for your syllabus, I'd think. Is less than Hasson. Ling Jinghao, Da Yu. He inclined his head, the ghost of a real smile edging his mouth. For a heartbeat, their history hovered. Insults in corridors. Wands drawn for the wrong reasons. Books slammed shut in fury. Neither of them reached for an apology. The moment didn't need it. They stood there in the quiet of a used classroom, sharing something wordless and solid. A truce that had grown roots while they weren't looking. After Sammy left, Hermione didn't leave with her. The conversation that followed was meant to be perfunctory. Notes. Observations. A few formal questions about safety protocols and curriculum balance. It lasted longer than that. They drifted slowly into old stories. Not the worst of them. Not yet. Quidditch matches lost by an inch. A cursed necklace that had set half the staff twitching. The absurdity of exams scheduled the week after near disasters. He found himself laughing. Properly. She counted his sarcasm with dry clarity. He teased her about revision timetables and color-coded notes. Awkwardness threaded through it, yes. But beneath that, something sturdier. They had been forged, separately, in the same fire. There was a familiarity in that shared burn. Eventually, Hermione slid her quill into its case and tucked the notepad under her arm. Her official mask slipped a fraction as she looked at him. "You're doing good work here, Malfoy." No flourish. No hedging. Just the flat, unmistakable truth of it. "I hope you realize that." For a breath, he had no armor ready. No dismissive remark polished and waiting. He swallowed. Nodded once. "Thank you," he said, quietly enough that the stone seemed to lean in to hear it. She turned toward the door. He watched her get almost there. Old habits rose, wicked and familiar, like muscle memory. "Granger," he called, before she could step out into the corridor. She paused, half-shadowed in the doorway, the castle's winter light spilling around her. He let the smirk return, just a little. Just enough to prove that some parts of him were still his. Oh, and Granger. His voice chased her down the last few feet of stone. Light. Careless. Unmistakably him. She turned in the doorway, one hand on the frame, brows already arched in weary expectation. A glint sharpened his gray eyes. "Do be sure to tell the Weasel and Potter I send my regards, won't you?" He paused, savoring his own insolence. "I'm sure they're pining without me." Hermione's snort was pure, unvarnished past. She rolled her eyes with such eloquence the entire history of their school days seemed folded into the gesture. Barely contained exasperation. A ghost of amusement. "Be well, Malfoy." It slipped out softer than she intended. Sincere, despite herself. Her head shook once, as if she could dislodge the warmth from the words. A reluctant smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Then she was gone. Shoes tapping away along the corridor. Silence closing in behind her like a curtain. Draco stood for a moment, watching the space she'd left. The room felt larger. Less charged. More his. He huffed a laugh under his breath. Something small and incredulous. Old rivalry echoed faintly in the stone. Sharp edges blunted. Refiled into something almost friendly. He began to tidy. Text snapped shut under precise fingers. Parchment slid into orderly stacks. quills lined up, points immaculate. The small rituals grounded him. Lesson plans squared, chair pushed in, lamp flame lowered with a murmur. By the time he closed his office door, the corridor outside had settled into its evening hush. He walked alone through it. Steps measured. Robe hem whispering against weathered flagstones that remembered more than he did. At the great oak doors, he paused. The castle opened before him in slow, gathering color. Twilight bled across the grounds, staining the sky in bruised purples and smoky orange. The lake held the last of the light like a secret. Turrets and towers stood watchful against the horizon. Windows glowed in patches, each one a tiny world of noise and warmth. Draco stepped out, the cool air wrapping itself around him. For a long breath, he didn't move. He simply stood at the edge of the stone steps, looking. The wind tasted of damp earth and wood smoke, of broom polish and distant laughter drifting from the pitch. Hogwarts had always been like this at dusk. Suspended. Caught between day and night. Between danger and safety. Once, that had terrified him. All that in between. All that uncertainty. Now it felt like permission. He let his shoulders drop, fraction by fraction. The tension he wore like a second uniform eased under the weight of the gathering dark. The future rose up ahead of him, vast and unmarked. For the first time in years, it didn't look like a sentence. It looked like a path. Uneven. Uncertain. But walkable. The castle behind him. Once, it had been nothing but memory. A mausoleum of bad choices and worse orders. A place he had fled from and been grateful never to see again. Now, when he turned his head, he saw something different. Stone that had judged him. And let him back anyway. Walls that had watched him fail and falter. And still made room for his name on a classroom door. He had thought of this job as a penance. A debt. A long, narrow bridge to walk until his feet bled. Yet here he was. On the far side of a year that had not broken him. Surrounded by children who shouted "Professor" instead of "Coward." The thought he'd been avoiding all week nosed forward again. Stay. He pursed his lips, annoyed at himself, even for considering it. Write to McGonagall over summer. Tell her he'd be willing to return. Grudgingly. Naturally, he'd have to phrase it as a favor to her. To the school. To the sorry state of modern defensive magic. Anything but admit that he wanted to. A smirk curled at his mouth, private, dry. Not that I'm eager to stay, he muttered to the empty air. Someone just has to keep these idiots alive. The breeze caught his words and scattered them across the lawn. A knot of students loitered near the doors, half-packed trunks at their feet, saying drawn-out goodbyes. They spotted him, backs straightening instinctively. A few raised tentative hands. An awkward wave. A shouted, "Happy holidays, Professor," from somewhere in the cluster. He lifted a hand in return. A brief, almost careless gesture. It wasn't careless. They didn't need to know that. Their faces were bright, loud with futures they hadn't learned to fear yet. He wanted, fiercely and without warning, for them never to stand where he had once stood is less than Hasson. Ling Jing Hao Da Yu, on the wrong side of a wand. On the wrong side of history. The feeling settled in his chest. Heavy. Sincere. Threaded through, as always, with sarcasm like a familiar shield. This place had been his undoing. Then his proving ground. Now it was dangerously close to being something like home. He exhaled, long and slow. The decision wasn't made. Not allowed. Not yet. But a line he hadn't noticed himself drawing had already been crossed. This is where I am, he thought, looking up at the tallest tower. And it might be where I belong. He turned on the spot. The world snapped, folded, and rearranged. The castle, with all its history and second chances, vanished from his immediate sight. But it did not feel, this time, like leaving. Deep under the same ancient stone, somewhere between the echo of Draco's departure and the settling quiet of evening, another pair of footsteps dragged along the corridor. Alistair Valewood took the staircase down from Transfiguration as if the steps were personally offended by him. His shoes scuffed. Bag thumped dully against his hip. Sunlight, the last of it, slipped in through the high, arrow-slit windows of the middle courtyard. The beams slanted across the corridor in rich, molten gold. The light clung to dust motes. Picked out the rough edges of the stone. Tried, valiantly, to cast the place in a kinder glow. Alistair barely saw it. His mind was still trapped in the exam room. In that dreadful moment when the teacup on his desk had tried. It had sprouted something like feathers, yes. But they were patchy, gray, and bristling in the wrong directions. The thing had given a hoarse, apologetic squawk, half crockery, half bird, and flapped once before tipping straight off the desk. "Acceptable," Professor Rhee had said, the way some people announced funerals. The word gnawed at him now. Acceptable. As if he were a piece of furniture that wouldn't collapse under light pressure. His fingers ran along the length of his wand, following familiar grooves. The wood was warm from his grip. Again and again, he replayed his movements. The hesitation before the incantation. The way his wrist had faltered at the last moment. How the syllables had thinned out on his tongue. He knew the theory. He'd practiced the form. But when the silence of the exam hall settled and 20 other wands rose in unison, his nerves had sunk their claws in. Now the echo of that failure trudged alongside him, as solid as any ghost. The castle didn't help. At this time of year, the cold slid in under door frames and along corridors. Autumn made itself known with a low, steady creep of chill through the thick walls. Alistair hunched his shoulders against it, even though the air down here was only cool, not freezing. He caught a blur of motion in the corner of his eye. Turning his head, he found himself face to face with his own reflection in a suit of armor polished so carefully it might as well have been a mirror. The sight made him pause. An unruly shock of brown curls sat on his head like he'd lost a wrestling match with a small, disgruntled hedge. They stuck up at odd angles, a testament to the amount of time he'd spent raking his hands through them in irritation. Gray eyes stared back at him. Stubborn. Tired. Carrying the familiar, heavy mix of, "I can do better," and "what if I can't?" He'd grown over the summer. Everyone had said so when he'd returned. He'd come back taller, limbs stretched too fast, as though his bones had outpaced the rest of him. Now his school robes hung awkwardly. Sleeves that had once covered his wrists properly now flirted with mid-forearm. He tugged them down, annoyed at the petty reminder that everything was in some kind of uncomfortable transition. Around him, the corridor was alive with movement that barely touched him. Students swarmed past in clusters and whirlpools of noise. A trio of Gryffindors, fifth years, emerged from a side stair, laughing too loudly, arms laden with crinkling bags from honeydukes. The faint, sweet smell of chocolate frogs and peppermint swirled in their wake like a mocking cloud. They probably aced Transfiguration, he thought sourly, watching one of them juggle sweets like a show-off. A gaggle of second-year Hufflepuffs tore by next. They huddled around a sheet of parchment far too large for them, giggles spilling out as they angled it away from curious prefect eyes. Alistair caught a glimpse as they passed. A caricature of Professor Thaddeus' hooked nose, beady eyes grinned up from the page. Bunny ears wobbled atop his head. Tiny bats circled, spelling rude words in cursive. The sight drew an unwilling, tiny snort from Alistair's nose. Even here, where marks and expectations loomed like storm clouds, mischief still found cracks to grow through. Further ahead, a knot of Slytherins his own age strode past with the lazy confidence of people who assumed corridors belonged to them by default. He recognized a few. Housemates who breezed through practical exams and always sat near the back, trading jokes over borrowed notes. They were already plotting out loud. If Folly gets the bottles from his cousin, then we stash them in the old astronomy closet. And nobody says a word to Vex, or we're dead. Alistair let their conversation recede without joining in. Fire whiskey and secret parties sounded like a whole different life. One that belonged to people whose wands didn't shake in exam halls. He took the stairs down towards the lower levels. The portraits lining the walls watched him pass. A few inclined their heads in absent-minded greeting. One stern witch in high ruffs clucked disapprovingly under her breath, as though she'd taken personal offense at his slumped shoulders. The further he descended, the quieter the world became. The clamor of students rushing toward the main doors thinned out behind him. Even the castle seemed to breathe more slowly this deep in its bones. Down here, the stone was cooler. The air heavier. The torches burned weaker, blue-white flames licking at the air in tired flickers. Alistair's steps slowed. Without the distraction of noise, his mind spun back to the exam, circling it like a trapped bird. Maybe the incantation had been wrong. Not wrong, exactly just weak. He'd murmured instead of declared, hoped instead of commanded. Magic, he knew, liked certainty. His hadn't found any. Or perhaps it had been the angle. The one tip a fraction off. The swish too shallow. He pushed the theories around in his head like puzzle pieces that refused to lock together. Underneath the technical questions ran another voice. Lower. Sharper. His father's. Transfiguration is foundational, Alistair. Show them you can change the shape of a thing, and they'll believe you can change the shape of the world. Muddle basic spells, and you'll never be taken seriously in any ministry office that matters. The remembered words tasted like iron. Expectation dressed up as advice. He scowled, temper pricking. A small stone lay in his path. He lashed out, sending it skittering into the shadows. It hit the far wall and vanished into blackness, making no real impression on anything. Much like him today, he thought bitterly. The torches along this stretch cast barely enough light to define the edges of the corridor. They made shallow dents in the gloom, leaving long stretches of shadow between them. Alistair exhaled hard, shaking himself once, physically, to pry his thoughts loose from the spiral. Brooding wouldn't change the grade inked on Professor Ree's parchment. If he stayed down here too long, the weight of his own disappointment would pin him in place. What I need, he decided, surprising himself with the thought, is noise. Fresh air. 2 sweet drinks. Somebody else's voice filling the spaces in his head. Hogsmeade could do that. A walk down the lane. Warm butterbeer between his hands. Maybe Carrie's easy way of turning disasters into stories instead of verdicts. The idea of seeing her, of letting her cut his self-pity down to size with a single raised eyebrow, steadied him. Resolve unfolded, thin but real. He turned back toward the Slytherin common room, the outlines of a plan forming. Change. Drop his bag. Leave the castle before he could talk himself out of it. He was almost at the concealed entrance when sound drifted to him on the draft. Not the usual clatter of students or the low rumble of the Black Lake pressing against the outer walls. Voices. Quiet. Clipped. Too low to make out the words, but edged with the unmistakable sharpness of adults trying not to be overheard. Alistair stopped. He knew these corridors. Knew where sound bounced, slid, concealed itself. The murmur came from just around the bend. From the door of the 6th-year potions classroom, if he had to guess. Curiosity pricked at him, clean and bright, cutting straight through his dull cloud of self-reproach. He inched forward. The door ahead stood mostly shut, a thin bar of candlelight leaking out at the bottom. The voices on the other side sharpened slightly. He could pick out rhythm, not content. The low rasp of Professor Thaddeus's drawl. Another tone layered over it, Professor Rowan's, light and brisk, even when worried. He pressed his ear gently to the wood. It might as well have been a wall of stone. Just muffled hum, no words. Alistair hesitated. He could keep walking. Mind his own business. Let the castle keep its secrets. His hand had already slipped into his pocket before he finished the thought. His fingers closed around something thin and rubbery. The extendable ear felt faintly warm to the touch, as though it lived for this. He'd nicked it last summer from Weasley's shop in Diagon Alley. Paid for most of his loot, of course. But the ear, it had practically begged to be liberated. He uncoiled it carefully. The flesh-colored string wriggled, as if impatient. As soon as he let it go, it slithered like a curious snake across the flagstones and under the door. Sound snapped into focus. Telling you, Rowan, he simply refuses. Professor Thaddeus's voice, all gravel and frayed patience. Metal clinked as he cleared glassware somewhere inside. "Refuses what?" came Professor Greenbrier's reply, leaves, and soil in her tone, even in exasperation. "To guard the pumpkin patch without his hat," Thaddeus said, as if reciting a particularly idiotic symptom. The Scarecrow's dug its heels in. "Well?" "Feet. Sticks. Whatever." Alistair blinked. He pressed the listening end of the ear closer, as though that would make the words make more sense. "You've tried repairs?" Rowan asked. Her footsteps creaked over floorboards. Alistair pictured her pacing between desks, hands worrying at the hem of her cardigan. "Charms. Hexes. Every mending spell I know, and a few I invented out of spite," Thaddeus grumbled. "Useless. He wants that specific hat. Says it's part of the contract." A drawer thudded shut. Liquid sloshed. "Meanwhile," Rowan sighed, "Doxies and Bowtruckles are treating the pumpkins like an all-you-can-eat buffet. If we don't get him back on his perch, there won't be a single decent pumpkin left for the autumn feast." "Ugh!" Paper rustled. Probably her endless lists. "We may have to cancel it," she said quietly. "And I'd rather not be lynched by 200 disappointed children under a rain of mashed turnip." Alistair's mouth twitched. A scarecrow on strike. Holding gourds hostage until his hat was returned with appropriate respect. He clapped a hand over his lips to smother the laugh, trying to escape. The image of professors negotiating with a sulking pile of straw was almost enough to banish the lingering weight of his exam. Almost. Because behind the absurdity lay a real threat. No pumpkins meant no glowing lanterns. No floating jack-o'-lanterns above the tables. No feast of warm pies and spiced cider that everyone raved about. He'd never been here for it before. Every previous autumn, his parents had collected him early, insisting on family tradition and proper seasonal rituals at home. This year, they were away. Off chasing dark artifacts in some damp corner of the world. He'd stayed. He'd been looking forward to it. Hearing the feast described, and finally sitting under that enchanted ceiling himself, instead of just imagining it through other people's stories. The thought of it being cancelled scraped at something raw inside his chest. He let the ear curl back to him, the voices blurring again into indistinct murmurs, as the little cord slithered under the door and into his waiting hand. Enough eavesdropping for one afternoon. If he stayed, he'd be tempted to burst in with some ill-advised offer of help. He tucked the ear away, shook out his shoulders, and headed for the common room. The stone archway admitted him with the familiar, smooth grind of moving rock. The Slytherin common room spread out before him, washed in greenish light from the lake pressing in on the windows. Ripples of water cast wavering patterns across stone and leather. The giant squid glided past at that moment, its shadow swallowing the room for a heartbeat before drifting on. The fire crackled, orange and steady, a warm counterpoint to the cold tones of the rest of the space. Alistair crossed to his dorm quickly. Uniform off. Dark green hoodie on. Jeans that actually fit his new height. He raked a hand through his curls, tried to flatten them. They sprang back up with cheerful defiance. The enchanted comb on his bedside table flicked its teeth at him irritably when he grabbed for it. After a few sharp nips to his fingers, he surrendered. Fine. The hair would win today. Along with everything else. He slung his bag over one shoulder and stepped back out into the chill. Hogsmeade waited. And, more importantly, Carrie. Carrie Valois, who could reduce a full-blown crisis to a wry anecdote in under 3 minutes. Who collected obscure facts the way some wizards collected chocolate frog cards. Ravenclaw to his Slytherin. Comfort to his knot of anxiety. He headed for the main staircase, feet remembering the route even while his mind chewed on scarecrows, exams, and missing hats. The castle unfurled around him. Staircases groaned and shuffled into new positions. Portraits argued over chess moves and fashion choices. The smell of ink, parchment, and potion ingredients formed a permanent underlayer to all other scents. He had no intention of following the usual stream of students down to the front doors. Too slow. Too crowded. Instead, at the third landing, he slid behind a heavy tapestry depicting a medieval jeweler weighed down with entirely impractical gemstones. The fabric fell back into place behind him, muffling the castle's main artery of noise. A narrow stairwell curled away downwards, hidden in the wall. He knew every uneven step. He'd found this route in third year while sprinting away from a vindictive poltergeist and 3 exploding ink bottles. Now, it served as a private back door to the kitchens, and, beyond them, a quicker route out. The air grew warmer as he descended. Lanterns hung at intervals, their light sputtering a soft yellow. Moisture slicked the stone where underground springs bled through tiny cracks. The contrast hit him as he reached the bottom. Heat rolled out in a wave the moment he pushed open the crooked wooden door. The kitchen was chaos in motion. Dozens of house elves zipped from stove to counter to pantry and back again. Pots and pans clanged and floated and stirred themselves. Steam rose in fragrant columns, roasting meats, buttery pastry, sugar, and something tart and spicy that made his mouth water. Copper cauldrons lined the long hearths, some bubbling with soups, others with thick, caramel-colored sauces that smelled like toasted sugar and apples. A tray of pastries shot past his head, narrowly avoiding collision with a levitating platter of roasted vegetables. "Good afternoon, Mr. Valewood." The greeting came from his left, high and delighted. Wicket waved from atop a tottering stack of flour sacks, a miniature scarf in Gryffindor colors wound proudly around his scrawny neck. Alistair winced at the mangled surname, but smiled anyway. "Afternoon, Wicket," he said, lifting a hand. "Just passing through." "Passing through is best time," Wicket chirped, gesturing broadly enough to dust himself in a fine coat of flour. "We is having many extra treats today." Alistair's eyes had already found one of them. On a nearby counter, a tray of cream puffs shaped like tiny golden balls sat cooling, their tops painted with delicate, shimmering icing to look like wings mid-beat. Golden snitches made of pastry. He drifted closer, as if pulled. The elves were busy. Focused. It wasn't really stealing if they were practically begging to be admired, was it? Is less than Hasson. Ling Jing Hao Da Yu. He palmed two, quick and practiced. One disappeared into his hoodie pocket. The other? He bit into it, the shell giving way to a soft explosion of cream and citrus and something faintly fizzy. Sweetness flooded his tongue. For a moment, the botched teacup, the scarecrow, the looming threat of a feastless autumn all retreated. Head chewed. Swallowed. Let the warmth of the kitchen sink into his bones. Then he squared his shoulders again and headed for the far door, where a side passage would lead him up, out, and towards a village that smelled of smoke, sugar, and second chances. Just as he angled toward the side door, hoping to vanish unnoticed into the cool stone beyond, a shadow detached itself from a pile of gleaming pans. Malkin. Older than most of the others. Apron starched to battlefield stiffness. Ears folded back in a way that meant he had seen everything and been unimpressed by most of it. The house elf planted himself squarely in Alistair's path, arms crossed, narrow eyes fixed on the suspicious bulge of his hoodie pocket. "Mm-hmm," Malkin hummed, slow as treacle. Young wizards should know better than to steal from the kitchens. The words snapped like a reprimand. The look that followed softened them into something almost fond. He shook his head, ears flapping, a tiny theatrical display of outrage. Then, with a conspiratorial twitch of his mouth, he winked. Alistair's shoulders loosened. Caught. But not really. He snorted, unrepentant, and popped the rest of the cream puff into his mouth before Malkin could stage a more serious intervention. "Evidence," he mumbled around the mouthful, "has already been destroyed." Malkin's sigh could have extinguished a bonfire. Still, his hands were already busy directing a swarm of spoons back into proper formation, which in kitchen language meant the matter was dropped. Alistair angled past him, steps lightening as he homed in on the far archway that led to the secret passage. Then he heard it. Soft. Thin. A broken little sound that didn't belong in this room of clatter and bustle. Sobbing. It echoed oddly in the rafters, threading itself between the clang of pots and the whir of knives. His feet slowed. He turned, scanning the corners. There. Near a crate stacked with jars of pickled beetroot, half hidden behind a wobbling tower of pie tins. Tilly. He recognized her, one of the newer elves, barely up to his waist, her ears too big for her narrow face, eyes already huge and now swollen, red-rimmed and drowning in tears. She sat hunched on the crate, knees pulled close, shoulders shaking so hard her hat kept slipping to one side. "Tilly?" he said, surprised at how his voice gentled on her name. Her head jerked up. For a heartbeat, she looked like a startled animal caught in wandlight. Then she ducked again, scrubbing frantically at her cheeks with the back of one spindly arm, as if she could erase the evidence. Alistair approached slowly. No sudden movements. No looming. He crouched until his eyes were almost level with hers, the kitchen floor cool against his knees. "Hey," he said quietly. "What's wrong?" Tilly sniffed. Twice. Her lower lip wobbled fiercely, as though it were trying to hold a dam in place and losing. "Tilly is fine, sir," she tried. The lie crumpled mid-sentence. "Tilly is... The rest dissolved into another wave of sobs. Elves glanced over, exchanging worried looks. No one intervened. They were busy, and besides wizards, comforting wailing elves was not standard kitchen protocol. Alistair hesitated, then remembered the extra lump of pastry in his pocket. He fished it out, holding the tiny golden puff like a peace offering. "Here," he said. "Best in the castle might help." For a second, he thought it had worked. Tilly stared at the treat, eyes glistening, breath catching. Then she let out a noise that could only be described as a wail. "No." The sound rose and cracked, ricocheting off copper and stone, startling a flock of plates into near collision. Several elves winced. One dropped a ladle. It clanged across the flagstones like a panicked bell. Alistair flinched. Right. So not a cream puff situation. "Tilly, hey," he started, but she barreled right over him, her words tumbling out in hiccuping bursts. "It's all Tilly's fault, sir," she sobbed. "All Tilly's fault, yes, it is." Her thin fingers twisted together until the knuckles went white. Tilly took the scarecrow's hat." The confession exploded out of her like a hex. "As a joke," she rushed on before he could react. "Tilly was only playing, only borrowing, just for a little run around the pumpkins." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, trailing into the collar of her pillowcase. "But Tilly dropped it," she whispered. "Near the sweet shop with the sugar quills, sir. Tilly dropped it and now it is gone, and the scarecrow is angry, and the pumpkins is ruined, and the feast." She gulped for air. "The feast is ruined, and it is all Tilly's fault." The word ruined seemed to echo, too big for her small chest. Alistair's stomach dipped. Pieces clicked into place. The staff's muttering in the potions room. The stubborn scarecrow. The threatened cancellation. He'd thought it ridiculous then. A sulking pile of straw holding the entire school hostage over a hat. It didn't look ridiculous now. Not with Tilly folded in on herself, racked by guilt so heavy it might crush her. He felt something twist sharply in his ribs. He'd made stupid mistakes before. ones that felt enormous in his own head, ones his father's voice would never let him forget. But at least his errors hadn't threatened a tradition half the castle was counting on. He set the cream puff gently beside her on the crate, no longer trying to press it into her hands. "Hey," he said softer. "Look at me." It took her a moment. When she did, her eyes were huge and raw, reflections of the pots and flames swimming in their depths. He reached out, hesitated, then patted her thin shoulder once. Awkward but steady. "Listen," he said. "You made a mistake. A really, really annoying one, sure, but it doesn't mean everything's ruined." "Tilly," she hiccuped. "Tilly lost the hat, sir. The scarecrow won't work. Professor Greenbrier is saying the feast will be cancelled." He finished for her. "Yeah, I heard." Her face crumpled again. He tightened his grip lightly, pulling her focus back before she could disappear into another storm of tears. "Okay, well," he said, as if they were discussing a homework problem instead of an impending school-wide disaster, "then we fix it." Tilly blinked. "We fix it?" she echoed, as though the concept were so outlandish it needed tasting before she believed it. "I'll find the hat," he said. "Near the sweet shop, right? I'll track it down and get it back to the scarecrow before the feast." He tried to infuse the promise with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Her hand's still." "Really?" The word came out tiny. You would do that for Tilly?" "For you," he said. "And for the pumpkins. And, selfishly, for the food." A corner of her mouth twitched, the ghost of an almost laugh trembling there. Alistair gave her shoulder another quick, reassuring squeeze. "I mean it," he said. "We'll sort it, so try not to, you know." He gestured vaguely at her tear-streaked face. "Drown yourself." Tilly sniffled hard, dragging her sleeve over her cheeks again. "Tilly will try, sir." Her eyes shone now not just with tears, but with something like hope. He stood, knees cracking faintly. "Good," he said. "And maybe eat that before someone else nicks it." He nodded at the abandoned cream puff. Tilly stared at it, then at him, then gave a small, solemn nod back. Resolve settled like a stone in his chest. Weighty, grounding. He'd told her he'd fix it. That meant he had to. Alistair turned away, weaving through the whirlwind of elves and levitating trays, mind already leaping ahead. Out of the bright kitchen, into the low, crooked side passage where torchlight sputtered and roots wormed through the ceiling. The air changed as soon as he stepped through the back door. Warmth dropped away, replaced by the cool breath of earth. The corridor he entered was barely more than a tunnel hacked through the bedrock. Roots from the orchard above dangled down like dry, tangled fingers. Dirt had sifted onto the flagstones in loose patches, soft under his trainers. He pulled his hoodie tighter as he walked, brushing stray crumbs and soil off the front. The silence down here was thick. No voice, no ticking clocks. Only the faint drip of unseen water and the whisper of his own footsteps. Oddly, it calmed him. No professors. No exam scripts. No fathers. Just stone. And a problem he might actually be able to solve. The passage sloped gently upward, the ceiling lowering in places until he ducked instinctively. After several long minutes, the tunnel spat him out into the world with a shove of cold air and weak, late-afternoon light. He emerged behind the shrieking shack. The building loomed to his right, skeletal against the sky. Its timbers creaked faintly with every gust of wind, joints complaining like old bones. Windows stared out, dark and blind. The roof leaned at an angle that looked frankly unsafe, as though the whole thing might shrug and collapse if someone breathed too hard on it. Alistair gave it the respectful distance it demanded. He'd grown up on enough stories about this place, most of them nonsense, some of them probably not to avoid poking sleeping legends. Beyond the derelict house, the village unfurled. Hogsmeade. He stepped out from behind the crooked fence, and the world shifted. Color flooded in. The lane was threaded with garlands of autumn leaves, charmed to keep their fiery oranges and reds no matter how the wind worried them. They rustled overhead in bright rivers whenever someone passed beneath. Street lamps, newly lit against the paling day, glowed amber. Their light spilled over cobbles and booth heels, catching in puddles and window glass. Every shopfront seemed to have dressed itself for the season. Barrels of enchanted apples gleamed like polished rubies outside the grocer's. They occasionally shivered, shook off imaginary raindrops, and rearranged themselves with tiny, smug hops.